The U.S. is dying as a civilization, a people, a nation, but it's going to be reborn. I'm Rich Pawson for Critical Point. All right, let's begin. This should be a 3 or 4 part series. And part 1, we're going to start with looking at the 1780s to 2020s as one phase of our history that's coming to an end. We're doing away with democracy. Our capitalism is burning out. People are mean, ugly, unhealthy, mentally, physically ill. Politics, divisiveness, a little bit of soft civil war, soft revolution going on. Okay? Now, this period of time is about a 200-year cycle. I call it the Pawson 216-year cycle as a business cycle for our economy, but as an SC1 for the stock market when it ends with something like 70 or 90% down in the stock market. That occurred in the 1930s, but as a culture civilization, we need to time it to the more of the birth of this country, and it's coming out that our 250-year anniversary coming up here is actually the ending of that cycle. We're in a death winter phase and ending that phase of 1780s to 2020s. Okay? Now, of that phase, what we have is our population, the middle class, percent middle class of the U.S. population grew from about 6% around 1800 up to maybe about 70% or something like that in the 1970s. And it turned out that the percent middle class getting a share of the U.S. GDP, the share of the economy, also started out about 4, 6, probably no more than 10%, rose to about 30% in the Gilded Age, meaning not doing that well necessarily, set back in the Depression, but then rose on up to about 60% or something like that in the 1970s. However, from 1980s to now, the size of the population of the middle class has declined. Some became rich, some became poor. The percent of the income or portion of the economy relative to GDP declined at a more sharp pace. Now, I did that on my own research, but I also asked AI to tell me something about this, and it came up with 1800s, 1970s, grows both size and income shares, 1970s to present. Population declines, incomes decline more sharply, and we see these divergences where the rich get richer, the poor are maybe stable, but the middle class is slipping. Now, we'll discuss more in the future of that 200-year pattern, but think of it that it trifurcates or divides into 3 periods of history. And we have the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to World War II, also includes the 1930s Depression from the economy side. Then from World War II or Depression into the 2020s, we're now in the death phase of this one. Now this breaks 12 generations into 3 groups of 4 generations each. Those 4 generations relate to about an 85 year cycle. Okay. Now, generationalist people use that, and Strauss and Howe in their book, The Fourth Turning, and I think Howe is writing a new book now, they show and explain that. I learned a lot of this on my own, and many years after they wrote their book, I realized they had some of this as well on generations. I tie this into the stock market and economy. I even use the stock market and economy to help predict where we're going on culture, society, civilization. All right, so this pattern for the stock market or economy is about a 72-year business cycle, 3 of them. For the generations, it's about 85-year lifetime cycle. For the stock market, I call it an SC2 when it's always been down about 57 to 90% in its death phase. It last struck in 2009 and had a shadow event with the COVID and that decline, as well as a bottom for interest rates and inflation. Okay. Now, this pattern from 1940s to 2020s, that's when the U.S. became the leader of the world. And now you can see under Trump we're destroying that, but you can also say we were working on that before Trump, okay? And we'll explain more on that in the future details here. But what I want to go with is that these 4 generations, according to generationalists, there's literally 4 types of generations. Your generation, you are similar, more similar than dissimilar, to a generation that is 4 generations prior to you. Okay, so that's how far it goes back, and that's why we repeat this, because it's so far back we forget and we don't learn, and we wind up making the same mistakes as well as the same positive things. So it's a fascinating thing of how it works. Okay, now we can divide this 70 to 80, 90 year type pattern, we can divide it by bifurcation, divide it in half, and we come up with generation 1 and 2 of the 1940s, 1980s. Now, generalists don't seem to do that. I do it because I discovered an SC3 supercycle of 30 to over 40 years for the stock market. For the economy, I call it a 36-year business cycle, but it's 30 to over 40 years. And it turns out 30 to over 40 years is 2 generations. And so generation 1 and 2 occurred in that period of time. And that's where the U.S. was really aggressive taking over the world. But at the same time, we were taking care of people and business in the U.S. We had big labor unions. Middle class and poor were doing very, very well. Okay. Now, 1980s to 2020s, we go into generation 3 and 4. And I'm going to show in a bit that things started to break down, even though the rich and some people did better and better still. All right. This SC3, again, about a 30 to over 40 year pattern, and the same for those 4 generations. So we break the 12 generations into units of 4 generations. Now, we can divide that, split it again, bifurcate, to generation 3 of 1980s to 2000s. And you can see we did great, but there were complications and problems, and I'll explain that in a bit. But we can see from 2000s to 2020s, we're in generation 4. Generation 4 is always bad. Those are the bad people there, and it reflects people who are mentally ill, physically ill. They're a little bit insane. They're a little bit on the dark, evil, sinful side, even spiritually religious. Everything starts to be corrupted, healthcare and politics and philosophy. The list just goes on and on. Capitalism starts burning out. It starts working against us, trickle economics, and we're there. You can see history has repeated, okay? But when we break this down, we're breaking it into what's called an 18-year business cycle for the economy, an SC4 for the stock market, and in its death phase, we always get a recession. We get, and sometimes far more important than that, and we also get the stock market down minus 20 to minus 60%, more likely minus 35 to minus 60%, okay? So now what we have to consider is that we're in that death phase, and it's going to end around the 2020s here. And in the next part 2 video, I will discuss when is it going to end and what's going to occur, bringing in generation 1, which some generalists people call the heroes, okay? So we're into that phase, and by the way, generation-wise, I say a generation is 17 to 27 years, just like a cycle in the business stock market, but most people round it off at 20, 21 years, but they also say it is a wide range, a bit vague. It's difficult to define, okay? So just keep in mind, generation 4, always bad, and here we are, we're repeating history again. Now, take a look at consumer sentiment as an indicator. There's also indicators how happy we are, and from 2000 to now, it's a downtrend of happiness. We're unhappy people. But for the consumer sentiment, notice it started with President Reagan and moved on up into President Clinton, and Clinton was just another Republican. This was all about republicanism, conservatism, more business, more capitalism, and make the rich richer. But the American people bought into it. They said, let's go for it. Let's see what we can get. Then it rolls over and comes down from 2000 right into the gutter, right into the lowest price here. Historically, what we see is it was coming down under George W. Bush, and of course Y2K and the Iraq War, and then the financial crisis. Okay, then we see it got better under Obama, but as Trump come in, it stopped getting better and started to roll over. Then the COVID come in, which you could argue could happen with anybody, and it slam dunked there, but it got worse and then turned back up on Biden. So Obama had the biggest recovery, but you could argue Obama created, the Obamacare, but other than that, Obama was like another Republican. President Clinton was like another Republican. He was in favor of knocking down welfare. He was in favor of financialization, rentier economics, free market global trade. Okay, he was another Republican, did it very, very well, better than Republicans, and had one of the better stock markets, and the people were the happiest because they thought it was going to work. But from 2000 beyond, what's occurred is the middle class has realized it really isn't working. And it's now even working against them. And under Trump, it's against them. It's just too much to handle, okay? So we're doing away with the neoliberalism. We're basically destroying everything from 1980 to now. We're destroying everything from 1930s, 40s to now. And we're destroying everything from 1780s, 90s to now, okay? All right, now we also have to take into consideration this chart. This blue line shows our economy, what it's worth in dollars. Starting with President Reagan, we exploded money printing, and we are in an MMT money system, modern monetary theory, but it's not a theory. We have that kind of printing machine. The Republicans swayed it more to money going to the rich and big business, okay? And that money kind of gets clogged up in Banker Street, Wall Street, and the rich. It really doesn't get out there to build the economy. How do we know this? Well, this exploded for the economy in dollar terms. We can draw a line of money printing that just shows it also exploding just like that. But look at the percent GDP. We actually slowed the economy. From 1980 to now, an economist, Steve Keen, who's an MMTer and also has his own software to how to show things around the world and this and that, he was saying the economy was 2.8% from 1980 to now, GDP. From 1980 back to the 50s, maybe 40s, 30s, you can come up with about 4% or more. And I did this in the 2000s and said, there's something wrong here. This isn't really working right. It's like we had the car set on 60 miles an hour, speed cruise control. We knocked it down to 40, cut it by a third. How can that be when we printed all that money? Well, most of that money is going to rich, Banker Street, Wall Street. It doesn't really come out into our economy. It's not working. All right, that's the conclusion of part one. Part two, I'm going to go back and revisit this crisis period. Who are the people causing this crisis? A little hint is baby boomers and Gen Xers, not millennials and Zers. And then I'm going to discuss when is this crisis going to end? And how about the Generation 1 coming up, which the generations call the heroes. I think they might be the savior, okay? When are we going to get things better, and what will that look like, as well as how is the rest of this century going to progress? Go to criticalpointpod.com and please tell people about this video. I want to get a lot more followers going here, and be prepared. Stay tuned for part two. Thank you.